welcome to this episode of the Dave Cast on this Tuesday, July 28th, as we continue in our study of the book of Exodus. Let's begin today by doing this little exercise. I want you to pretend that you have been made judge for the day and you have a docket of cases you are going to be hearing this afternoon. And so here, let me give you the three cases that are coming before you this afternoon. Okay? Case number one. Two men become angry at one another and they got into a fight. And one of them was severely injured in the fight, and now he's going to be confined to bed for several weeks. What responsibility does the other man have toward the injured man? Case number one. Case number two, a boy borrowed a donkey, and then someone stole the donkey from him. Is the boy financially responsible for the donkey? Does the boy need to compensate the owner of the donkey for the loss? And then finally, case number three, and there is this woman who's been treated very poorly by her neighbors for several years, and they often ridicule her and her family and put them down. And so one day she's walking down the road, and she discovers a cow that belongs to those neighbors wandering by itself to the road. So what responsibility does she have? What does the woman do? Okay, those are the three cases. You be thinking about how you're going to decide those cases, and we'll get back to them in a minute. So I just want to give you a quick review as where we are and what we are doing in this study. We are now in the 51st episode of the Dave Cast. I guess we missed celebrating that back on Saturday, but oh well, we could have done the 50th. We'll do the 100th. But anyway, I decided that maybe somewhere along the line that teaching straight through a book of the Bible might be a good thing to do. And so the book that we chose was the Old Testament book of Exodus. And today we find ourselves on part 19, which is a pivotal point in our study. Back on Saturday, I talked about how there are two distinct parts of Exodus, really. There's the first half is largely narrative, and the second half is largely laws. Big blocks of laws followed by little snippets of narrative every now and then, but mostly big blocks of laws. And so the narrative part, the story part that we find in the first 20 chapters is very familiar to us. Those of us who have been in church for a while, we know the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, and then they go through the desert and the wilderness. They finally arrive at Mount Sinai, where they receive the 10 Commandments in this theophany. Remember, a theophany is a physical manifestation of God, but in this epic theophany, God speaks to them from fire and smoke and gives them the 10 Commandments that are found in the first part of Exodus 20, 1 through 17. And so that was apparently very terrifying for the Israelites, because the very next verse, verse 18, the people come to Moses. Well, I'm going to put it up on the screen. Okay, chapter 20, verse 18, it says, "When the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, 'Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die.'" And then also continuing in verse 20, "Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. God's come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning.'" And so from this point on in Exodus, this is exactly what happens. Moses goes up on the mountain, talks to God, and then brings some law and instruction back down to the people. But one thing I do want to point out here before moving on is what we essentially see here in Moses is this role of mediator, as one who willingly stands as the go-between God and the community. And don't miss this connection, because Moses, in a real sense, in this role, Moses is kind of a foreshadowing of Christ, who is our mediator, who opens a way to the presence of God for us. And so in thinking about this, isn't it interesting what Moses says to the Israelites? He says, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid." Because if you fast forward to the Gospels, just think about all the times Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not be afraid." All right, so then we move into a section that goes from 20 all the way through most of 23. And here now we have moved into the second half of Exodus, and we find, first of all, of one of several long lists of laws, some of them oddly specific laws. And just going through the headings that I had in my Bible, there are laws about idols and altars, laws about Hebrew slaves, personal injury laws, property laws, laws about social responsibility, laws of justice and responsibility, Sabbath laws, and laws about the 3 annual festivals that they're supposed to keep each year. So, all right, what's up with all this? What exactly is going on? Well, I remind you that throughout this study of Exodus, we keep going back to a couple of key themes. I keep reminding you of that. One is liberation. Specifically here, the liberation of Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And that, of course, is a theme that runs throughout the Bible and is ultimately fulfilled in Christ, liberating us from our sin. But here, the Israelites are freed from captivity in Egypt. And so now that the Israelites are free, how are they to live as a free people? And more specifically, how are they to live as a free people side by side in community? You know, yeah, you're free now, but how are you going to get along with your neighbors as God intends? How are you going to live free? And again, let me point ahead to the New Testament. Certainly we see this in the words of Jesus in the Gospels, but I think more specifically the letters, as those churches were trying to live out the words of Christ in community. And remember, they had all sorts of problems. And so the letters oftentimes, they were addressing some specific problems that those early churches, those early communities were struggling with. But getting back to Exodus, the one thing about being free, but how do you live in community? How are you going to live as a community together as free people? Specifically here is the people that is becoming the nation of Israel. I mean, there had to be order and governance. And so Moses had initially taken on all of that himself. And so if you'll remember a few episodes back, in chapter 18, I think it was, his father-in-law Jethro comes to visit, and he watched Moses sitting in the judge's chair from sun up to sundown, and he says, "Moses, why are you doing that?" And Moses says, "Well, because, the people, they have these disputes, and they bring them to me, and I decide between the parties involved, and then I inform them of God's decrees and instructions." And Jethro was like, no. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that in that way? I mean, that is not sustainable, son. You're going to kill yourself from overwork. And also, you're frustrating the people because you have this huge backlog of cases and people are waiting around for decisions on. So, son, go find some good, capable, trustworthy people and train them about God's decrees and instructions, and then appoint them to oversee these hearings. And listen, son, if you want to, you can still hear the big complicated stuff. But most of these matters I've been watching, they can be settled by other people that you appoint. Of course, I am really paraphrasing here, but that's pretty much the gist of it. And so the text tells us that Moses took Jethro's advice and did exactly that. And so really what we're seeing in these decrees and instructions for living together is that. And we're going to have this pretty much for the rest of Exodus. And so that leads us back to those 3 cases I gave you as a pretend judge. Remember, there's pretend judges, your 3 cases. The 2 men got into a fight, one's injured, and so he has to stay home from work. Does the other guy owe him money or something? Then there's a boy who borrowed a donkey, and someone stole it while it was in his possession. Now, what's his responsibility to the owners? And then finally, there's this woman whose neighbors were really, really mean to her. And one day, she discovers their cow wandering down the road. Well, believe it or not, the answers to every one of those cases are covered in the laws in these next few chapters. And so if your mind works like mine, you may be thinking at this point, okay, that's all fine and good, sure. And I can see that the 2 men getting in a fight, that sounds like a typical case that could come up time and again. But honestly, how often do you have a case where a mistreated woman finds one of her neighbor's cows wandering down the road? And so following this line of logic, how could there possibly be a case for every scenario that's going to come up? And let me say, first of all, there's going to be a lot more laws before this is all over. But if you stop to think of it, there are laws, and there are laws that set precedents. And even today, we hear judges making decisions, citing other laws as the reason they are ruling the way they are, right? Happens all the time. I mean, that's really kind of the way the law system works. And so over the next few episodes, we're going to drill down into some of those categories from the section headings that I gave you a second ago and look at some of the reasons those laws might have been included and also some of the problematic things that are associated with them. Because I'm going to be honest with you, some of the things we read about here are a little cringeworthy. And one of those categories we're actually going to be beginning on Thursday, and that has to do with slavery. I mean, they were slaves. How could they have slaves? But they did, and there were laws about it. So I want you to be thinking about a quote that I'm going to give you in a second about things like slavery and capital punishment laws, about putting people to death. We're going to run into some of those, and quite honestly, they give us pause. But anyway, this is the quote I want you to think about it. And it comes from, guess who? Walter Brueggemann, who you've heard me quote many, many times during the study so far. But he said this: "The ethics of the community is always playing catch-up with the theological passions that identify it." The ethics of the community is always playing catch-up with the theological passions that identify it. And I mean, we can see that in our own country, right? The Declaration of Independence, you know the first words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a wonderful theological passion to have, right? But did you know that 41 of those 56 original signers, they owned slaves? And quote unquote, all men are created equal? That just wasn't very inclusive in the use of pronouns, but in practice as well. Women couldn't vote till 1920. And although we've come a long way, we are still working on the created equal part of that declarations. The ethics of community is always playing catch up with the theological passions that identify it. I mean, I love to hold the ideology that the way to change our society for the good is by changing human hearts. And I believe that's true, but the reality is that changing the law is most often the first step to that change. Changed hearts may take a few years, at least for some people. The law gets changed, and then the hearts come later. And if you are a student of history, you will see this pattern throughout. You also will see a pattern of those, unfortunately, in positions of power who will fight these laws. And when the laws are finally passed, they will continue to use their privilege and their position and their power to impede that societal change. But thank God in our country there have been those along the way who were steadfast and courageous in the pursuit of freedom and justice. And so in that light, on this week that we are remembering the life and legacy of John Lewis, let me close with this today. When the Brown versus Board of Education passed, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "For all men," and I'm sure he also meant women, "for all men of goodwill, May 17th, 1954 marked a joyous end to the long night of enforced segregation. This decision made hope to millions of disinherited black men and women who had formerly dared only to dream of freedom." Friends, when Jesus of Nazareth died and rose again 2,000 years ago, he ended the long night of death under the law of Moses. Jesus' death sets free any who dared and dreamed and are willing to trust in him. And it's this very freedom that propels us to do justice and walk humbly. And so at the 48th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, John Lewis was speaking at the First United Methodist Church in Topeka, Kansas. And Topeka, Kansas was where the decision was handed down. And he said this: "We live in a different country, a better country, because of what happened here in 1954, and we must never forget it. We must tell the story again, over and over and over." Friends, as followers of Christ, we must never forget how Jesus gave his life so that we can have new hearts and live in the freedom that God intended for us. And we must tell this story again, over and over and over. And we must let the light of the gospel shine light in the dark places of our communities where our ethics are still playing catch up to this theological passion, so true freedom can be known and experienced by all. Well, thank you for watching today. I'll be back on Thursday with another episode of the Dave Cast. And until then, you keep bringing the hope.